Good evening. I am your creepy counselor, and you have found yourself here in the Vale. Before I approve your visa to travel to the other side, please take this with you. The creepy counselor reaches into his pocket and pulls out a pack of apple-flavored bubblegum. He hands it over to you with a smile. Okay, now you may go through. But before you go, please remember my advice. If you ever feel uneasy, or if they notice you at any point, run, and I will open the veil for you again. I had always loved driving at night. When I'd first learned to drive, I would steal my old man's car and go roaring down the rural back roads early in the morning. It gave me a sense of freedom. I had meant to set off at 8, but instead, I didn't start my long drive back until gone 10. I'd been out of town for a week, meeting some old friends and reliving the past. It was a 7-hour drive down, but that was during the day. Without any traffic, the drive should be cut down to around 5 hours tops. That was another reason I loved driving at night. I was a nervous driver when I was on the open freeway. In those moments, my safety depended on the competence of others, and I just had no faith in the competence of others. That night, I had barely met 2 cars before I had to pull over, the fuel gauge dancing worryingly close to E. I turned into a shitty little gas station that was still a few miles out of the edge of town. Some teenagers were working the till. He had school books splayed out on the counter and he was barely awake. He jumped when I walked in. I bought a pack of apple-flavored gum and put $30 on the tank. I walked out of the artificially lit convenience store and into the darkness surrounding my car. I drove a 1971 Plymouth Barracuda. She was my pride and joy. As I gently filled her up, I subconsciously rested my eyes. I jolted back to lucidity just before I fully fell asleep. I realized I had overshot it and went back into the store to pay. The kid was gone, probably on a toilet break judging from the cans of Red Bull piled around his textbooks. So I left $10 by the register and called it a day. I got back in my car and got ready for the final stretch of the journey. Around 15 minutes later, I passed another car. It was a white sedan, fresh out of the 1980s. It was the type of car I would have whistled at if it drove by me in the street. On either side of the road was a thick forest, as impenetrable as the darkness just outside of the range of my headlights. I was used to a lack of sleep, but this was starting to get to me. I was chewing gum and listening to the radio. All it picked out was static, but that was better than silence. I had half a thermos of coffee resting on the back seat. I was planning on saving it for later on in the journey, but I had almost forgotten about it. As my eyelids became heavier, I took one hand off the wheel and tried to reach for the flask behind me. Still focusing on the road, I groped for it, but to no avail. My hand brushed past the cold metal, but I couldn't quite seem to grasp it. I exhaled and turned around. I saw the damn thing resting in between the 2 back seats. I reached over a little and grabbed it, and that's when it happened. I saw something streak across my windshield out of my peripheral vision. A great weight struck the car as I span around and stamped my foot on the brake so hard I thought the pedal would buckle under the force. My car came to a screeching halt. I sat there for a minute, my hands holding onto the wheel so hard my knuckles were turning white, and I tried to get my breathing under control. I thought about driving on and not looking back, happy to think I had just hit an unfortunate deer and left it at that. I had hit a deer back in '98. This place was crawling with them, and they seemed almost suicidal, the amount of them that jumped in front of cars this time of year. But I decided against that, and racked with anxiety, I got out of my car. Laying on the cold gravel of the road was a body, a human body. I stared in horror as I realized what I had done. His legs were a crumpled mess, his right arm was bent at an impossible angle, and his head, Oh God. His head bore the brunt of the force. It was bisected down the middle. His face was gone, unrecognizable, and clumps of gray matter oozed out from between two shards of his skull. The old black frock jacket he had been wearing was now filled with blood. My front headlight had shattered. I felt a twinge of guilt checking what damage was done to my car. It should have been the least of my worries, I know. As bad as it is to say, I was planning on leaving the body right there, driving home and forgetting about the night with the help of my good friend, Jack Daniels. But then, I heard the low rumble of a motor. A car was coming. I was in fight or flight mode, and I did the first thing that made sense at the time. I had an old blanket in the trunk laid out for my dog when we went to the beach. It stunk of wet dog, but somehow I didn't think the body would mind. I rolled it out in the road and pushed the new corpse onto it as the headlights of the oncoming car neared. The contents of his head were spilling out everywhere, so I grabbed a plastic target bag and wrapped it around his head, keeping everything in one place. I lifted the body, and to my surprise, he was unusually light. It felt like lifting a small child. I cursed myself for falling in love with a car with such little space in the trunk as I crammed the body inside, closing it just as I was illuminated by a station wagon's headlights. To my horror, it did not keep going. It came to a halt next to me and the driver started to roll down his window. Instead of accusing me of murder, the tired-looking driver asked me for directions. I saw his wife sitting in the passenger seat. His 3 kids were in the back. All of them were asleep. The man asked me for directions to the nearest motel. The nearest one I could think of was a cheap shithole called Sir's Sleep-A-Lot. I had stayed there when my marriage was on the rocks, just before the divorce. I told him he had missed the turn for it, and he had to turn around, drive 1.5 miles, take a left, and then keep driving for another 2 miles. He smiled wearily and thanked me. He started to wind his window back up when he stopped. I was turning back to my car when he asked me if I had broken down and needed any help. I assured him I was fine, and he thanked me again and took off into the night. I got back into the driver's seat and just sat there for a while, thinking about what I should do. I must have spent almost an hour shivering in my seat, weighing my options. I've listened to enough true crime podcasts to know how to hide a body, but I didn't think I could stomach dismembering him. But I knew what I had to do. I started my car up and began the last leg of my journey. I passed the moss-covered sign welcoming me back to my hometown. I drove through the empty streets, each house occupied by a sleeping family. I pulled into my street just out on the edge of the suburbs. I realized for the first time that my hands were shaking. I tried to get it under control as I parked in my driveway and got out, stretching my weary legs. I made my way to the trunk and opened it. I half hoped the body wouldn't be there and that this had all been just some bad fever dream I had at the wheel. But, of course, it was still there, stained in blood and crumpled into the fetal position, still wrapped in my dog's blanket with a plastic bag bearing the Target logo, keeping his head in one place. I leaned in to lift him out. As I did, a voice behind me said, with little emotion, "Hello." I whipped around. Standing by his car on the other side of the fence was my neighbor, a religious but sweet guy called Gary. I always saw him as my very own Ned Flanders. I slammed my trunk shut and nonchalantly leaned against it. I greeted him, and we both just stood there, awkwardly, for what felt like a lifetime. Eventually, Gary said, "Well, see you later," before turning and getting in his car. I stood where I was and watched him drive off until he was out of sight. I wondered what he could be doing at 3:30 in the morning. but it felt weird of me to be suspicious of someone when I was about to bury the body of a man I had just killed. I made sure there were no other nocturnal neighbors around, and I opened my trunk once again. I picked up the strangely light corpse and nudged the trunk shut with my elbow. I hastily walked over to my front door and set the body down, fumbling with my keys. I opened the door and dragged him inside. I pulled him across the carpet, wincing at the mess I had to clean up, and to the basement door. I opened it and gently brought him down the rotting wooden steps. There was a patch of dirt in the corner of my basement where an old washing machine had been. I kept meaning to cement it over, but thankfully never got around to it. I laid the body down next to the dirt patch. I rolled him out of the blanket and got a good look at him for the first time. Not that I particularly wanted to. I bunched up the blood-stained blanket and set it down on a workbench I never used. My sister had been looking after my dog Lassie while I was away. I was supposed to pick her up tomorrow, but I didn't fancy the idea of her digging up the remains. Since I didn't have a shed, I kept a shovel in the same little room under the stairs where I kept the boiler. As I walked back up the basement stairs, I realized my shake was back. The brevity of what I was about to do was taking hold. I made a B-turn to the kitchen and fumbled with the lock on my liquor cabinet. I took out a half-empty bottle of 90 proof and slumped into an old oak chair, the sole inheritance from my grandfather. Once it was finished, I began to reason with myself. I thought the man I killed might have been the person who was responsible for the recent spate of disappearances. A serial killer who was stalking the back roads late at night, who fell victim to a weary driver. If this was true, then what I had done was a net positive to the world, so I clung to that thought. That's when I heard a noise. It was the type of noise you'd hear as you were drifting off to sleep, the type of noise that'd tear you back into lucidity. I heard it again. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. I put the bottle down and made my way out of the kitchen. I stood in front of the basement door waiting to see if I could hear it again. I must have stood there for a minute or two in perfect silence. I took a deep breath and grabbed the shovel from the cramped storeroom. Either way, it was time for me to do what needed to be done. With a heavy heart, I opened the door. Standing amongst the shadows at the foot of the stairs was the body. I realized to my horror that the noise I heard was the thing's bones snapping back into place. It stood there, staring up at me. It still had the plastic bag over its head, but I could tell it was staring directly into my eyes. I let out a whimper and took a step back. The body let out a shrill scream as its feet left the ground. It floated there for a second, as I was frozen from shock. The body jerked and came hurtling up the stairs. I was snapped out of my trance and acted quickly enough to slam the door shut. The force that hit it from the other side shook the hinges. I gritted my teeth, desperately trying to hold the door shut as the body pounded it and snarled from the other side. I looked down at the shovel by my side. I took a hand away from the door to grab it, and as soon as I did, I felt the weight hit me. I almost let it loose from the basement. I grabbed the shovel and wedged it in between the door and the wall behind me. I mustered up enough courage to let go of the door and winced. Thankfully, the shovel was enough to keep it in place. I hopped over the spade, ran past the blood-stained carpet, and stupidly ran past the front door. Instead, I went upstairs to my bedroom. I staggered to my closet and dropped to my knees. I took out the Webley revolver my father gave me when I first moved out. I kept it along with some loose ammunition wrapped in a piece of tinfoil in a shoebox. I hastily loaded it and got to my feet. I held it like I had seen in detective films. All I know about guns is they shoot. I never learned how to use them properly. Never thought I needed to. I made my way down the landing and crouched when I got to the stairs. I warily took 3 steps down to get a view of the basement's entrance. The door was wide open. The shovel had been snapped in half. I raised my gun and pointed it at the shadows in the area where I thought the body might be. It felt weird calling it a body, but I didn't know what else to say. I kept my gun level, but heard a noise slowly getting louder. It sounded like a flock of birds landing on the roof. I looked around for its source and saw it. The body was crawling upside down on the ceiling. It had just crawled out of the doorway from the dining room and into the living room and was coming straight for me. I stumbled backwards and ran back into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I hid under my bed and held my breath. I heard the body take dull, methodical steps until it stopped directly outside my door. I fought the urge to scream. From my little hiding spot, I saw my bedroom door slowly creaking open, and the body walked in. All I could see of it was its feet, which were clubbed and malformed like a polio victim. Its skin was bone white and dotted with dark purple pustules. Each step looked more painful than the last as it walked around my room. Its breathing was labored and muffled slightly by the plastic bag that it still hadn't taken away from its face. I didn't move a muscle. I was paralyzed with fear. I don't think I even breathed. I watched it hobble around my bedroom until it was satisfied I was nowhere to be found. It slowly turned around and walked back out. I stayed where I was for a few minutes, trying desperately to think of what to do next. I calmed myself, got my shaking under control, and rolled out from under the bed. The body was floating in the middle of my room, a meter or so off the ground. It was hunched over where it met the ceiling and looked directly at me. It dived toward me and I fired blindly. I was inexperienced with using a gun, but I was so close to it, it was almost impossible to miss. All 5 shots hit their target. The body faltered in the air and slammed into my bedside cabinet. I got to my feet and scrambled to my door. I looked back to see the body convulsing. I ran in abject terror and made my way down the stairs in a controlled fall. I hadn't even reached the ground before the body came hurtling out of the room, flying through the air as if something had thrown it. I grabbed my keys from the little ceramic bowl by the front door and fumbled with them until I found the right one. I burst out of my house and ran frantically down the driveway to my car. I opened the door and fell into the driver's seat. When I looked up, I saw the body standing in the doorway of my house. It slowly reached for its face and ripped the plastic shopping bag off. I wish it hadn't. The body flung itself at the car just as I got the engine going. It latched onto the hood and let out a guttural cry as it started to violently headbutt the windscreen. I pulled into the street and drove blindly into the night. Cracks appeared on the glass and I feared it would shatter. Its forehead was bleeding now, but it didn't seem to care. It was then I got a good look at its face, and its skin was a tallow white with a molted texture of chronic rheumatism. Its eyes were pure black and leaking vile pus from the edges. Its nose and ears looked like they had been gnarled off by a rabid dog, leaving only scarred, shapeless stumps. The thing's gums were necrotic. Its teeth were shattered and ripping through exposed nerves. All but the front canines, which seemed dagger-like and immaculate. I hit the brakes. The body flew from the hood and skidded across the tarmac road, degloving any exposed skin as it slid, leaving a trail of blood behind it. I revved my car before driving over the body for the second time that night. I stopped and collected myself. I took a deep breath in and another out. I held the steering wheel tightly and focused my mind. As I was calming myself, I saw something move from the corner of my eye. I looked in the wing mirror to see the body slowly rise to its feet. I turned around in my seat and stared slack-jawed at it. It looked back at me before dropping to all fours. I watched as it scurried down the street to my house. It looked back at me one more time as it stood up and calmly walked into my home. the front door slamming shut behind it. At this point, a few neighbors had woken up. From the sirens in the distance, I knew at least one person had phoned 911. I drove to the outskirts of town, parked up at the bridge, and slept for the first time in what felt like a week. I woke up to a teenager banging on my door, laughing as I jolted awake and running off to continue his walk to school. On the tank of fumes, I made my way to my sister's. I write to you now from her guest room, my dog Lassie curled up at my feet. I planned on going back to my house. My sister had convinced me that most of what happened that night was just a weird experience with a crackhead. It wasn't until writing this all down did I realize how bullshit of an excuse that is.